In September 1960, Congress made it a federal crime for a radio station to take payment for playing a specific record without telling its listeners. That law is still on the books. In November 2020, a streaming platform with more active listeners than every radio station in America combined launched a program that does exactly what that law was written to prevent. An artist or their label identifies a song they want pushed. The platform agrees to recommend it more often to more people inside its personalized listening features. In exchange, the artist accepts a lower royalty rate on every stream that placement generates. No envelope changes hands. No disclosure is required, and none is given. No law applies, because technically, nobody broadcast anything. The platform just adjusted a recommendation, and recommendations, it turns out, sit entirely outside the statute that was built for radio. The exact transaction that ended disc jockeys' careers and triggered a congressional hearing in 1960 is, in 2026, a checkbox inside an artist's dashboard. This is a video about how that happened, and about a much stranger discovery underneath it, which is that on some of the platform's biggest playlists, the artist on the other end of the transaction might not exist at all. Let's establish the mechanics precisely, because the program's own language is doing a lot of quiet work. The feature is called Discovery Mode. It launched in test form in November 2020, and it works like this. An artist, or more often their label, goes into Spotify's own artist-facing dashboard and opts specific tracks in. Once enrolled, that track receives a priority signal inside Spotify's algorithmic listening contexts, specifically radio and autoplay, the features that keep playing automatically once you've finished an album or a playlist and haven't told it to stop. It does not touch editorial playlists, the ones curated by human Spotify staff. It does not touch a listener's own saved playlists or their searches. It is scoped narrowly to the algorithm's own recommendations. In exchange, the artist accepts a 30% reduction in royalty, applied only to the additional streams Discovery Mode generates. If a listener later saves the song and plays it from their own library, that stream pays the normal, full rate. Only the algorithmically boosted plays are discounted. Spotify's blog post announcing this, and the phrasing is worth hearing in full because it's a small masterpiece of neutral corporate language, was titled, "Amplifying Artist Input in Your Personalized Recommendations." The company described the arrangement as artists agreeing to be paid a promotional recording royalty rate for streams in personalized listening sessions where Spotify provided this service. Read that twice. It never uses the words pay, buy, or advertise. It describes a royalty rate being paid to Spotify by the artist, framed as a service Spotify is providing. The transaction is real. The vocabulary was built specifically so that it wouldn't sound like one. Music advocacy groups made the comparison almost immediately, and it's the right one, so let's do it properly rather than just asserting it. Classic radio Payola worked like this. A label wanted a song played. A program director or DJ controlled which songs got airtime. The label paid the DJ in cash or in kind, and the song got played, with the audience never told that money changed hands to put it there. Discovery Mode works like this. An artist wants a song heard. Spotify's recommendation algorithm controls which songs get surfaced. The artist pays Spotify through a royalty discount rather than cash up front, and the song gets surfaced more, with the audience never told that a payment arrangement is why they're hearing it right now instead of something else. The structural difference that matters legally is this. 1960s Payola regulation was written specifically to cover broadcasters, because broadcasting used the public airwaves, which are a licensed public resource. A streaming recommendation engine is not a broadcaster in the legal sense. It is a private company's private software making a private editorial choice about what to show you. The 1960 statute doesn't reach it, and nothing has been written since that does either. So the same behavior that required a federal law and congressional hearings to even partially suppress in one medium arrived completely legally in the next medium, because the law that stops it was built for the shape of the old problem and never updated for the shape of the new one. Spotify's own public defense, when critics raised this, was that the company had published a general guide to how its recommendations work, including a section on what it calls commercial considerations, which is true. It is also true that Spotify has never published, and does not require artists to disclose, which specific songs in your Discovery Weekly or your autoplay queue are there because of Discovery Mode, and which are there because the algorithm actually thinks you'll like them. You cannot, as a listener, tell the difference. That is the entire design. Here is the part that makes this genuinely more insidious than 1960s Payola, rather than just its modern cousin. Old-style Payola was a variable cost. A label paid a DJ per play, per market, per deal. It scaled roughly with how much attention they wanted to buy, and a small independent label with almost no promotional budget could, at least in theory, still get a record heard by finding one sympathetic DJ. Discovery Mode's cost isn't cash. It's a percentage of revenue the artist would otherwise have earned, which means the price of participating scales automatically with your existing success. And it also means a major label with an enormous catalog can enroll hundreds of tracks simultaneously, absorbing a 30% discount across an ocean of songs that were already generating substantial algorithmic plays anyway. In a way, an unsigned independent artist with 3 songs and 1,100 monthly listeners simply cannot use to meaningfully move the needle. And there's a second-order effect that several artists and advocacy voices have raised directly. Discovery Mode doesn't just move the enrolled song up. Algorithmic playlist space is a fixed resource. There are only so many songs autoplay can queue up in any given session. If a large catalog enrolls broadly, the tracks it displaces are definitionally everyone who didn't or couldn't enroll. Spotify has never published data confirming or denying the scale of this displacement effect. The company's position is that Discovery Mode functions more like paid advertising than Payola, because artists only pay when it works, and the underlying engagement signals, skip rate, save rate, completion rate, still ultimately decide whether a track keeps circulating after the boost period ends. That's a real distinction, and it's worth stating fairly. Discovery Mode cannot, by itself, force a bad song onto millions of playlists forever. It buys a shot, not a guarantee. But you have to also pay to get a better shot is precisely the Payola dynamic dressed in the language of a marketing product. And the company saying, it's not really Payola, it's more like an ad, is functionally the same argument the labels made to Congress in 1960, just aimed at a different regulator that, so far, hasn't been asked the question. Quick pause to connect the dots across the whole series properly, because this is where the through line sharpens. Video 2 covered how, after the 1960 hearings, Payola didn't disappear. It moved to independent promoters, middlemen the law didn't clearly cover, and by 2005, the 4 major labels were paying $30 million combined to settle allegations that the practice had continued essentially unbroken for 45 years. Laptops and contest prize concealment and all. Notice what both eras of Payola required. Somebody had to find the seam in an existing law and exploit it quietly, hoping not to get caught. Discovery Mode requires none of that. It isn't a workaround. It's not hidden in a shell company or disguised as a contest prize. It's listed publicly on Spotify's own official artist website with a name, a percentage, and an onboarding flow. The 1960 statute's entire strategy was to make the broadcaster the liable party and force disclosure. Spotify solved that problem simply by not being a broadcaster and by building the payment mechanism into a royalty rate rather than a cash transfer, which sidesteps the disclosed payment framing entirely. There's no separate payment to disclose, just a lower number on a royalty statement that most listeners will never see. 66 years of Payola enforcement, and the exploit finally closed itself just by changing which side of the transaction was allowed to advertise. Now for the part of this story that has nothing to do with money changing hands for a real song, and everything to do with whether the artist exists at all. In 2016, the trade publication Music Business Worldwide reported a rumor that had been circulating among independent labels. that some of Spotify's most followed mood-based editorial playlists, the ones built around jazz, chill, peaceful piano, focus, and similar low-key genres, were populated with a meaningful volume of tracks credited to pseudonymous artists, sourced not from independent musicians but directly from production music companies working to a brief. The journalist, who chased this down over the following years, Liz Pelly, eventually published a book-length investigation titled Mood Machine, drawing on dozens of sources, several of whom requested anonymity, citing fear of professional retaliation. Her reporting describes an internal Spotify program with the anodyne name Perfect Fit Content. Production companies, some based in Sweden, contracted to supply stock instrumental tracks engineered to match specific moods and playlist themes: jazz, chill, piano, released under one-off artist names invented for the purpose, and licensed to Spotify at rates reported to be considerably lower than what the platform would pay out to a typical artist generating the same volume of streams through its standard royalty structure. I want to be careful and precise about what's confirmed and what isn't, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets flattened into something simpler than it is. What's well documented: pseudonymous single-release artist names attached to functional mood music have appeared repeatedly on Spotify's own editorial playlists, tracing back to a small number of production companies with reported informal or formal relationships to Spotify across multiple independent investigations spanning nearly a decade. What Spotify has consistently maintained, going back to the earliest reporting in 2016, that it does not itself create music, and that any licensing arrangements with production companies are ordinary commercial relationships no different from licensing any other catalog. What the reporting has never established: proof that Spotify writes or performs the music itself, or a complete, verified list of every pseudonymous name involved. So hold the accurate version of this in your head. Nobody has proven Spotify is secretly a record label making its own music. What multiple independent investigations across nearly a decade have converged on is something narrower, and in some ways stranger, that a platform whose entire pitch to listeners is personal music discovery has, on at least some of its highest follower playlists, populated the discovery with tracks selected in part because they're cheaper to license than the real, findable artist would have cost, without ever telling the listener that's the criterion in play. You opened a jazz playlist for a dinner party. You may not have been listening to jazz musicians. You may have been listening to a production company's product line, priced to be profitable, wearing a person's name that doesn't answer to anyone. Everything so far has been Spotify's own choices made legally, disclosed in varying degrees. Now, the version of this story that is unambiguously a crime. Between 2017 and 2024, a 52-year-old North Carolina musician named Michael Smith ran what federal prosecutors would later call the first criminal case of its kind. Smith used generative AI to produce hundreds of thousands of songs, uploaded them to Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and YouTube Music under invented band names, and then built a network that, at its peak, ran roughly 10,000 active bot accounts to stream them. The mechanics, laid out in his own indictment, are almost mundane in how deliberately unglamorous they are. 52 cloud service accounts, 20 bot profiles apiece, each bot programmed to behave like an ordinary, human listener, logging in, playing a rotating set of around 600 songs a day, logging off, specifically so the pattern wouldn't trip the platform's fraud detection, which was already, even then, looking for exactly out kind of robot uniformity a smaller, cruder operation would have produced. At full scale, Smith's network generated over 660,000 fraudulent streams a day. He emailed himself financial projections. He emailed co-conspirators asking them to help him generate more songs faster, specifically, in his own words, to get around the anti-fraud policies these guys are all using now. Over 7 years, he diverted more than $10 million in royalties, money that exists inside a shared finite pool that every legitimate stream on these platforms also draws from. He pleaded guilty in 2025 to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and agreed to forfeit just over $8 million. Here is the sentence I want to sit with, because it's the actual point of including this chapter rather than just a curiosity. Smith's fraud and Spotify's discovery mode are, in the most literal mechanical sense, doing the same thing, converting artificially inflated attention into royalty income that real listeners' real engagement did not organically produce. One of them is a federal crime carrying a 5-year maximum sentence. The other is a feature listed on the company's own website with a name and a logo. The difference isn't the mechanism. It's who owns the toll booth. Smith was stealing from a system he didn't control. Spotify built a smaller, legal, disclosed version of the exact same trick into the system it does control and sells it back to the artists who need it most. To be fair to Spotify, and the series has tried to be fair to every institution in it, the company does actively fight the Michael Smith category of fraud, and has for years. Since 2023, Spotify has run detection systems specifically targeting artificial streaming, and starting in April 2024, it began financially penalizing the distributors and labels responsible. A charge of roughly €10 per track whenever the overwhelming majority of that track's streams. The reported threshold is 90%, are identified as artificial. Flagged streams don't earn royalties and don't count toward public play figures or chart eligibility. Repeat or severe offenders can be removed from the platform entirely. It's worth noting who that threshold actually catches. A track has to be almost entirely fraudulent, 90% artificial, before the fee applies, which in practice means the policy is built to catch operations like Smith's, bulk, industrial-scale fraud factories. It is not built, and was never intended, to catch a track that's substantially real with a modest artificial boost layered on top of legitimate engagement. Which brings the chapter full circle. Spotify has built real, meaningful enforcement against the unauthorized version of stream manipulation, while simultaneously operating an authorized version of a closely related transaction as an official revenue-generating product. Both facts are true. Neither cancels the other out. The company is, genuinely, the police, the landlord, and, through Discovery Mode's 30% commission, a direct financial beneficiary of one specific legal form of the exact behavior it prosecutes distributors for enabling in every other form. Here's where all 4 videos in this series actually land, if you've watched them in order. The Grammys tried to measure something that can't be measured, and every fix produced the same complaint it was meant to solve. The charts measured something real, and every fix against manipulation produced a smarter manipulation. The IIAA plaque never measured what it claimed to in the first place, because the people measuring were the people being measured. And here, in the newest and youngest of the 4 institutions, the pattern doesn't even need 60 years to complete a full cycle. It happened inside one company, inside one decade. Payola was outlawed in 1960 because an unaccountable middleman controlled what got heard and got paid to decide. 60 years later, the unaccountable middleman is the platform itself, and instead of being regulated out of that position, it simply monetized it, published the price list, and called it artist input. None of the people involved in this video did anything mysterious. Spotify built a product that serves its own revenue, exactly like any company does. Independent artists took a discount they felt they had no real alternative to, exactly like a small-town record shop in 1958 took a rigged consignment deal it couldn't afford to refuse. Michael Smith saw an opening in a system built on trust and streams per dollar and industrialized it, exactly like every other person in this series who found a formula and worked out how to feed it. The moral of the story was never that any single actor is uniquely corrupt. It's that whoever sits at the center of a measurement system, the committee, the chart, the certifying body, the platform, ends up holding 2 jobs that were never supposed to be held by the same hand, deciding what gets heard and profiting from that decision. Every institution in this series has, eventually, been asked to do both at once. Every single one of them said yes.